guys, and welcome back to Beauty in the Bookcase, where we take a book and we make a look. Today's video is all about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. No, not the sci-fi novel, The Invisible Man, but the seminal novel about the treatment of African Americans in the United States after the Civil War, in a story that really transcends times and still rings true today. So Ralph Ellison was born in Oklahoma in 1914. His father always had dreams of him being a poet, and it's no doubt that with the work that he did, his father would definitely be proud of him. So Ellison actually attended the Tuskegee Institute, which was founded by Booker T. Washington, and that really played a role in his life, as well as when he moved down to Harlem and had the opportunity of meeting the poet Langston Hughes. Very much like the main character of our story, Ellison had really high hopes of his life at the Tuskegee Institute, but ended up feeling quite disillusioned with his experience. And honestly, he felt more like an outsider while he was there than he did in his whole life. So while he was in Harlem, he actually got involved with a communist group. And again, a lot of the background information that I learned about Ellison seems to play a role in Invisible Man, leading us to potentially believe that our nameless narrator is actually Ellison himself. So our narrator spent a large portion of his life sort of playing into the role of who he thought people expected him to be. Quiet, polite, agreeable, and very understanding of his place in society as compared to his white counterparts. So early on, he actually gives a speech in which he's presenting those views that despite the need for equality in America, the black man did need to remember that he was still below the white man. To him, the only way the African American community would thrive and move forward after slavery would be to remember their place instead of trying to fight for more rights. Essentially, our narrator's belief can be summarized as if you educate yourself but you remember your place in society, then everything will be okay, as long as you don't step out of line and think you're actually equal. However, this view was very quickly debunked by the same white people that he was lauding. Throughout the story, our narrator is actually often humiliated, objectified, and made to fight. He's made to strip of his clothes, and he realizes very quickly that to a lot of the people around him, he was just a domesticated savage. He wasn't their equal, and he wasn't a person with value as a person. Instead, he was just a more formal version of the caricature they'd created. All this behavior goes as far as him having to be involved in this battle royale organized by these men who, under the pretense of letting him give a speech on equality, actually forced him to fight other black men because they truly didn't care what his message was. They just wanted to see black men to serve for their entertainment. So our character had spent most of his life being a model student, and he intended on continuing being a model student when he attended university. However, he was very quickly disillusioned with that dream, as he saw that even though the institution was run by a black man that he dreamt of working for, he was still made to bow and play a character for the white people who actually gave the money to the institute. Quickly enough, the rigged educational system casts him out of the university and into the streets of Harlem, where he struggles to even find work until he stumbles upon a paint factory that takes him in. And that paint factory in and of itself has a lot of racial commentary on it, since the whole slogan is white is best, if I'm not misremembering. But essentially, he's just constantly making white paint, which is actually made with a little bit of black in it. The whole thing stands for sort of like a metaphor on how white society was built by African Americans, but that's often looked over. However, the most interesting part of his time in Harlem is his involvement with an organization called the Brotherhood. Now, the Brotherhood was a multiracial communist organization that allegedly fought for equality, but really they were willing to change their views for the highest bidder. And we'll talk a little bit more about the role that the Brotherhood plays in his life later on. So he's originally recruited due to his great public speaking abilities. They had heard him talk after a African-American family had been evicted, and that's the moment where they sweep in and they're like, hey, you should join us. Now, of course, being a well-educated man with a dream of really doing something that mattered, this opportunity was paramount for our narrator. However, in reality, although the narrator's speech got him an invite into the society wanted to make sure that he knew his place. Nobody could be above anybody else, and our narrator couldn't really have any power. Despite the fact that he could move people to action and change with his words, they didn't want him to be able to do that. This is all exacerbated when one of the ex-members of the Brotherhood is actually shot down by a police officer. He was outselling what they called Sambo dolls, which seemed to be some type of almost like a racist caricature that was turned into a toy and sold back then. And this really, of course, bothers our narrator because he was, Clifton, who's the guy who was selling the dolls. He used to be part of the Brotherhood and he used to fight for their cause. So he's really confused as to why this happens. But then he gets brutally shut down and murdered by a white police officer, which then leads our narrator to decide to hold a public funeral for Clifton. Now, this did not sit well with the Brotherhood, which started to show to our narrator that perhaps the Brotherhood wasn't exactly who they painted themselves out to be. So let's talk then about the Brotherhood and what they really could or could not stand for. Now, the Brotherhood stands for a lot of things in the story. Of course, they have the whole communist society that Langston Hughes actually invited Ellison into, but Clifton was actually another very smart, outspoken man. However, he and our narrator had opposing views. Essentially, these two characters, the narrator and Clifton, are meant to represent W.E.B. Du Bois, or Webb Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. So the narrator is more like Booker T. Washington, who really wanted to achieve equality by appealing to the white man and becoming part of their efforts to bring on equality. And essentially, Booker T. Washington seemed to believe that if the black man just stayed in their lane and worked hard enough, they would be able to be treated as equal. Du Bois, on the other hand, who is represented by Clifton, believed that it wasn't hard work. They didn't have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps to achieve equality, but instead they deserved a better education system and they deserved to have their civil rights given to them because they were already equal. But then we see Clifton being shot down and after having already turned against the Brotherhood. So why is that? Well, it seems that Clifton realized something that our narrator doesn't realize until then, which is the organization, the Brotherhood, they didn't really care about what he had to say. Clifton and our narrator were really more like accessories. There were little pawns in their scheme so that they could seem like they were more what we'd call now woke than they actually were. The organization didn't really care to give these Black educated men a voice. They were just happy to find Black men that were willing to act the role that they wanted them to be. They were willing to put on a show to fit into white society. The Brotherhood in and of itself ends up presenting a very, very flawed version of allyship. Now, that's not to say that every single form of allyship is flawed, especially nowadays, but very often people will have their token Black friend or their token Black employee, etc., to, fill in a quota and look like they're diverse and open, but they don't actually give these people of color an opportunity to take a more direct and involved approach and change. Essentially hiding under the guise of, oh, we have Black men in our society, so we can't, we're obviously trying to be part of the change. It seems that the Brotherhood was kind of just doing what we'd call today virtue signaling. Like some political groups, the Brotherhood was more interested in putting power before actually, doing the right thing. Brother Jack, who is our narrator's main contact with the Brotherhood, often reminds our narrator that when he is to speak, he needs to remain polite and not be too specific or incendiary. He, after all, needs to be appealing to everyone, so he can't really speak his mind, can he? And he was very, very concerned with the possibility of our narrator actually getting a bit of an ego, which, while at first may just seem like he was concerned and trying to provide useful advice to our narrator, it really was their way of saying, don't get ahead of yourself. Remember your place in this society and in this world. Essentially, it's a thinly veiled threat that says you have the power, but you're not allowed to use it. And if you step out of line, we will cut you down. So assuming that Clifton had also faced this type of treatment from the Brotherhood, it's a little easier to understand why he'd turn on them and go and do something as radical as going on to sell these racist dolls, which was kind of a 180 from what he was originally doing with the organization. He felt used. He realized he was being used. He realized that his voice didn't really matter, and it was never going to matter to the Brotherhood because they didn't really care about change. Essentially, Clifton is here to show our narrator what could become of him if he doesn't walk away from the Brotherhood. Of course, we can't really talk about Invisible Man without talking about race. Now, so far I've spoken about the two different points of views between Dubois and Booker T. Washington. However, as we've discussed the ideas of integration, we haven't discussed the idea of separatism or Black separatism. So this ideal is basically presented by a character named Raz the Exhorter/Destroyer. And he's more than just a guy with a pretty neat name. Raz actually has his own plan for what the African American community should actually do. So to him, he doesn't think that the community should continue to conform and meet the expectations of white people, nor does he agree that they need to fight for civil rights. Raz actually encourages them to connect more with their African roots. Now, of course, being the children, grandchildren, etc. of slaves, a lot of them don't have a huge connection to their countries of origin. They just know that they came from Africa. Yet if Raz was to hear the expression sort of like go back to Africa, which is often used as an insult towards African Americans in this country, he would potentially even agree with it. Not because he believes that the African American community doesn't have a place and shouldn't belong in the United States, but because he wanted them to be their own community. He wanted a unity in the African American community that no longer felt the need to impress or beg for their rights. He wanted the community to actually acknowledge that the people around him were white devils, and instead of trying to conform and get their approval, Raz's extremism was actually calling for them to make their own rules, to not have to demand rights or equality because they were already born with them in Africa and they didn't need to be groveling to the white man that saw them as lesser beings. Now, although Raz's extremism does end up in some race riots that seem to be actually the Brotherhood's main goal, there is a bit of truth to his beliefs. Now, I'm not saying that we should be trying to separate every racial or ethnic group from each other, nor am I saying that pitting two types of extremism or superiority is the correct way to move forward. However, what does stick out to me is this need for approval, and I've spoken about it before in that a lot of people of color living in America feel the need to perform whiteness. As we saw back in the day, and as we're still seeing today, it seems that respect and even equal rights for people of color and other minorities really isn't given out to everyone equally, but instead only to people who act the right way, and that often means acting white. For example, we see that today when another Black man or woman is shot down, and instead of grieving their deaths and demanding that justice be done, people start bringing up criminal records or their behavior as an excuse to why this horrible crime is okay, because they weren't acting white. They weren't acting the way that the white man expected them to act. They were too loud, they were angry, they weren't cooperating. But at the end of the day, if they weren't doing anything wrong, they had a right to be angry and to question why they were being stopped. To not comply was their right. Quite frankly, even in today's society, more often than not, if a person of color doesn't put on their white persona, they become expendable. Raz rejected this more than anything. He was sick of the whitewashing, and he wanted the African American community to have a true, genuine connection to African culture and to their roots. He wanted them to be able to connect so that even though their origin story had been stolen from them, they could still embrace it. So what's it all about? Upon first glance, Invisible Man is the story of America's racial history, but at its core, it's a story about identity and how self-perception is often quite different from what the world perceives us to be. Think about it. A narrator with no name who considers himself invisible to society. A man with a strong perception of self who's only seen as a savage, a rapist, and a fighter. Our nameless narrator often seems to float around different identities, but at the end of the day, isn't that what plenty of people of color are forced to do in America today? You're forced to turn off the Ebonics, lower your volume. You can't be angry. They'll call it passionate, but they're still saying you're being loud, and that's interpreted as rage, as violence, as something to fear instead of, more often than not, merited rage, merited anger. You straighten your curls, you wear the right clothes, and you behave as white as you can be and stay as quiet as possible just to stay alive, just to be safe and not feel threatened or judged. In a sense, people of color in America are invisible because they can only be their true authentic selves behind closed doors or in select neighborhoods. They can't show their true colors at work or around certain friends because then they break the illusion of whiteness. Sure, not everybody, but there are clearly too many instances where the second a person of color seems to step out of line, they're crucified for standing up for themselves, told that perhaps if they'd kept their voice down or if they just follow the rules or whatever, then maybe their point would have gone over better. But that's not really the case when a white counterpart does the same thing. It seems that deep down, Ellison's words still ring true. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Make sure that you subscribe for more videos like these. Let me know what you thought about this book and my analysis in the comments. Make sure to leave a like. Make sure you turn on that notification bell so you know exactly when I upload on Wednesdays and Sundays, and I will see you guys next time.